He was known for his power, she was just a little girl with tears in her eyes. That night, love, kindness, and humanity rewrote their stories. Before we dive deeper into this emotional story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching me from, and what time is it there right now? The city drowned under sheets of merciless rain, streets glistening with the reflection of neon lights, as Daniel Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black car, the powerful engine humming beneath him, while his mind replayed the ruthless arguments from the boardroom, his heart heavy with the emptiness of victories that meant nothing when celebrated alone, his blue eyes staring through the windshield, yet seeing only the shadows of a life defined by wealth but void of warmth. A man feared by his employees, respected by rivals, envied by strangers, and yet unknown to himself. Then, cutting through the roar of thunder and the slap of rain against glass, came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A cry, raw, desperate, shattering the silence of his isolation, piercing straight into the walls he had built around his soul, a fragile voice shrieking through the darkness. "Somebody help me, please!" And without thought, without calculation, without the cold logic that usually guided his every move, Daniel's foot slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the wet road, heart pounding like it hadn't in years, because that cry was not just noise, it was memory, it was pain, it was his own childhood echoing back at him, and as he stepped out, rain soaking through his expensive suit, he spotted her. A little girl, no more than 7, shivering on the roadside, hair plastered to her face, clutching a worn-out backpack as if it were the last treasure in her world, her lips trembling, eyes wide with terror, fragile shoulders shaking under the cold night, and Daniel, the man who never bent for anyone, found himself kneeling in the mud without hesitation, his voice softer than he knew it could be as he asked, "Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" But her sobbing answer stabbed deeper than any business loss ever had. "Please, don't let him take me back. Uncle Richard, he wants to leave me. In the streets." And in that instant the storm outside fused with the storm inside, memories he had buried clawing to the surface, himself as a boy, abandoned in the rain, clutching nothing but fear, no hand to hold, no voice to comfort. And he realized he wasn't just looking at a child, he was looking at a reflection of everything he had once been, everything he swore to forget, yet here it was alive in front of him, pleading for the one thing he had never received: protection. His throat tightened, breath caught, heart racing, because fate had placed her in his path not by accident, but by design, and though his instinct screamed to stay detached, his soul ached to reach out, to change the ending of her story, even if he could never rewrite his own. So his hand moved, trembling yet steady, reaching for hers in silent promise. But just as his fingertips brushed against her small, cold fingers, a chill worse than the rain ran down his spine, because in the corner of his eye, through the fog and the flicker of a street lamp, he caught it, a shadow, tall, watching, unmoving, a presence that did not belong to the storm, but to something darker. And in that split second Daniel knew this night was not just about chance, it was about choice, and his next move would change not only the life of the little girl, but his own forever. The shadow lingered for a breath too long, its stillness crawling under Daniel's skin, but when lightning cracked across the sky, it dissolved into the darkness, leaving only the sound of rain and the trembling child before him. And Daniel realized he had no time to waste. So with a steady hand he lifted Lily into his arms, her tiny body soaking his expensive suit, yet feeling lighter than the guilt pressing against his chest, and without another glance into the night, he carried her to his car, opening the door gently, placing her inside, with care as though she were glass, then slipping off his coat to drape it over her shivering frame, the scent of his cologne replacing the damp chill of the storm, but her sobs would not stop. Each tear falling like another crack against the walls of his guarded heart, so he leaned closer, his voice trembling against his own disbelief at how soft it sounded, promising, "You're safe now, no one's going to hurt you while I'm here." Yet she looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, her lips parting as if to ask a question too heavy for her age, and finally, in the faintest whisper she said, "You're the first person who stopped for me. Can I trust you?" And Daniel froze, the weight of those words heavier than the empire he controlled, because trust was something he himself had lost long ago, something he never believed he deserved, and yet hearing it from her broke something open inside, forcing him to answer with raw honesty. "I don't know if I deserve trust, but I promise I'll keep you safe tonight." And as her head lowered against the coat, she clutched it with the desperation of someone who had nothing else to hold, her breath uneven but softening, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt the fragile responsibility of being needed, not for his money, not for his power, but for his humanity. He started the engine, headlights cutting through the curtain of rain, the city blurring past as silence filled the car except for the sound of her muffled sobs, until suddenly she lifted her tear-streaked face and whispered with trembling urgency, "Please, take me to Mommy. She's sick. She's all I have." And Daniel's chest tightened, a storm rising inside him stronger than the one outside, because he heard not just a request but a plea of survival, and without hesitation he pressed harder on the accelerator, guiding the car through slippery streets, ignoring the flashing red lights of businesses closing for the night, his mind torn between the cruelty of the world that could leave a child in such fear, and the strange pull of destiny that had placed her cry in his path. Until finally the hospital's glow broke through the darkness, a sanctuary standing tall against despair, and Daniel swung the car into the emergency bay, rushing to open her door, lifting her once more into his arms as she clung to his neck with the strength of someone terrified of letting go, her small voice guiding him, "This way. Please, hurry." And he followed her directions down sterile white halls until they reached a dim room where the smell of antiseptic mixed with quiet suffering, and there, on the bed, lay a woman pale as the sheets beneath her, chest rising shallowly, eyes half closed, skin glistening with fever, and Lily slipped from his arms, racing to the bedside, crying, "Mommy, I brought someone. He helped me." And the woman's weak eyelids fluttered open, gaze drifting first to the child she adored, then slowly, painfully, to the tall figure in the doorway, rain-soaked and breathless, and as her eyes locked with Daniel's, something unspoken flickered between them, recognition, memory, a tether from long ago, and though her lips trembled, though her voice was barely more than air, she whispered a name heavy with surprise and history. "Daniel?" And the sound of it shattered him, because how could this frail stranger know the name he had buried under success and shadows? How could her voice carry familiarity when he had no memory of hers? And yet deep in his chest something stirred, a forgotten warmth pressing against the cold armor of his soul, leaving him with the single haunting question, how did she know him? Daniel stood frozen, his name still trembling on Grace's lips, his heart pounding as though someone had reached into his chest and dragged out a memory he had buried for decades. And as he looked into her weary eyes, shadowed with pain but still carrying that same spark of kindness, he felt the walls of his carefully built world begin to tremble. For this was no ordinary woman lying weak before him. This was the girl from the dirt roads of his childhood, the girl who had shared her bread when his stomach had been empty, who had looked at him not as the abandoned boy left on the curb by parents who vanished, but as a human who deserved kindness. And though years had passed and fortunes had risen, the recognition was undeniable, the ghost of his past staring at him through the trembling frame of Grace Carter, and when she whispered, barely able to breathe, "I never thought I'd see you again, not like this." Daniel felt his throat tighten, his hand instinctively reaching forward though he hesitated, as if touching her would collapse the fragile thread of fate that had tied them back together, and his voice, usually sharp and commanding, cracked as he murmured, "All those years. And it's you?" And in that moment, time folded, the sterile hospital walls dissolving into the muddy alleys of their youth, the rain-soaked present blending with the hunger-stained past, and Lily, sensing something sacred between them, looked up curiously, her small hand clutching her mother's fingers tighter as if afraid she would slip away. But the silence, tender and heavy with memories unspoken, was shattered when the door burst open with a slam that made Lily flinch and Grace gasp, and in strode Richard Carter, his presence like a storm cloud rolling in, his shoes clacking against the linoleum, his eyes gleaming with greed as he surveyed the scene, a sneer twisting his face when he spotted Lily, and without even acknowledging his sister's frailty, he barked coldly, "She's a burden, Grace. She doesn't belong with you." his words slicing the fragile piece to pieces, and when his gaze landed on Daniel, recognition flickered for a moment followed by disdain as he adjusted his ill-fitted suit, puffing his chest like a man pretending to own a kingdom, when in truth he was nothing more than a scavenger circling the weak, and with venom in his tone he continued, "Stay out of this, Mr. Millionaire. You have no idea what you're stepping in. 2. Lily's inheritance will be handled by me, not by a dying woman or a stranger looking to play hero." And Lily's face crumpled as tears slid down her cheeks, her small voice breaking the air as she pleaded, "No, please don't take me." Her arms clinging desperately around Grace, who tried to hold her though her strength was failing, and Daniel, who had watched boardroom wars and ruthless takeovers, had never felt his blood boil like it did in that instant, every protective instinct roaring awake, his jaw clenching, his fists curling at his sides, for Richard's words were not simply greed, they were cruelty, an attempt to strip away the last source of light in a child's fragile world, and Daniel stepped forward, his towering frame blocking Richard's path, his blue eyes blazing with an unspoken warning, but Richard smirked, leaning close, his breath hot with malice as he hissed, "If you get involved, you'll regret it." And with that he turned sharply, his shoes echoing in the corridor as he left, but the stench of his threat lingered like poison in the room, and Daniel stood there, chest heaving, heart racing, Lily's frightened sobs tugging at him more deeply than any business deal or fortune ever had, while Grace's eyes, wet with tears, locked on his as though silently begging him not to abandon her child to the clutches of a man who had already proven he was capable of heartless greed, and in that charged silence, Daniel understood something he hadn't realized until that very moment, that this was no longer about charity or obligation, this was about destiny pulling him back into a life he had once thought lost, a life where kindness still mattered, a life where perhaps he could finally become the protector he once needed, and as the door clicked shut behind Richard's departure, Daniel knew one thing with startling clarity. Walking away was no longer an option, for he had just inherited a fight he could never turn his back on. Daniel stood frozen long after Richard's footsteps had vanished down the hospital corridor, the echo of that venomous threat gnawing at the edges of his mind. But when he turned back and saw Lily timidly rubbing her small hands together and glancing up at him with fearful eyes, the fire of defiance pushed away his hesitation, so instead of walking back into Grace's ward, where exhaustion weighed heavily on her frail body, he gently reached for Lily's tiny hand and asked if she would like something warm to eat, and together they walked in silence to the dimly lit cafeteria, where the hum of vending machines filled the empty air, and Lily, still dripping rainwater from her tangled hair, perched nervously on a chair that seemed far too big for her little frame, watching Daniel with curiosity as he returned carrying a tray with soup, bread, and a cup of hot chocolate topped with cream, the steam rising like fragile smoke between them. At first, she hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor as though afraid she might be scolded for taking too much. But when Daniel softly pushed the tray toward her and told her that this was hers, her lips trembled into a cautious smile, and she picked up the spoon with shaking fingers, sipping the broth as though it were the first meal she'd had in days, and Daniel, who had dined in the finest restaurants across the world, suddenly felt a lump in his throat watching how much joy a simple bowl of soup brought her, because in that moment he saw not just a little girl eating but a reminder of his own younger self sitting alone in the rain, starving and forgotten, until a kind girl with dark eyes had handed him half a sandwich, and the weight of that memory made him lean forward, brushing back his usual coldness, and whisper gently, asking if she liked it, to which Lily nodded shyly before lifting her eyes with surprising bravery, and murmuring words that pierced through his carefully built armor. "You're the first person who held my hand and didn't let go. Can I call you my hero?" And Daniel, a man who had faced cutthroat negotiations without flinching, felt his throat tighten and his eyes sting, struggling to hold back emotions he thought he had buried forever, so he managed to smile through the ache and answer in a voice that cracked against his will. "No, sweetheart, I'm no hero, but I promise, I'll never let you cry alone again." And for a fleeting second Lily leaned across the table and placed her tiny palm over his much larger one, her warmth soaking through his skin as though she were healing something broken inside him. And Daniel realized that this fragile bond forming between them was not built on blood or obligation, but on something deeper. humanity, trust, and the desperate need of two lonely souls finding each other in a storm. Yet even as the tender moment settled, shadows of Richard's threat loomed large in his mind, reminding him that this fragile peace could be shattered at any second, and that thought made him grip her hand tighter, silently vowing that no amount of money, greed, or manipulation would ever let this child feel abandoned again. The tension in the hospital corridor thickened until it was almost unbearable, Richard's fingers still red from the grip he had left on Lily's fragile arm, Daniel towering before him like a storm waiting to break, his face carved with fury that seemed too controlled, too dangerous, and when Richard sneered, spitting the words, "She's not your problem, Hayes. Walk away." The sound echoed like poison in the sterile hallway, but Daniel's restraint snapped, his voice rising like thunder, roaring with a conviction that silenced even the hum of the fluorescent lights above. "She's a child, not a burden. If you want her, you'll have to go through me." And the declaration wasn't just a threat, it was a promise forged in the fires of his own broken past, a vow that the abandoned boy he once was wouldn't ever let another child suffer the same fate, and Lily, trembling, clung to the edge of his jacket, her wide eyes darting between the two men as if she could sense the invisible war raging between edges of his mind. But when he turned back and saw Lily timidly rubbing her small hands together and glancing up at him with fearful eyes, the fire of defiance pushed away his hesitation, so instead of walking back into Grace's ward, where exhaustion weighed heavily on her frail body, he gently reached for Lily's tiny hand and asked if she would like something warm to eat, and together they walked in silence to the dimly lit cafeteria, where the hum of vending machines filled the empty air, and Lily, still dripping rainwater from her tangled hair, perched nervously on a chair that seemed far too big for her little frame, watching Daniel with curiosity as he returned carrying a tray with soup, bread, and a cup of hot chocolate topped with cream, the steam rising like fragile smoke between them. At first, she hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor as though afraid she might be scolded for taking too much. But when Daniel softly pushed the tray toward her and told her that this was hers, her lips trembled into a cautious smile, and she picked up the spoon with shaking fingers, sipping the broth as though it were the first meal she'd had in days, and Daniel, who had dined in the finest restaurants across the world, suddenly felt a lump in his throat watching how much joy a simple bowl of soup brought her, because in that moment he saw not just a little girl eating but a reminder of his own younger self sitting alone in the rain, starving and forgotten, until a kind girl with dark eyes had handed him half a sandwich, and the weight of that memory made him lean forward, brushing back his usual coldness, and whisper gently, asking if she liked it, to which Lily nodded shyly before lifting her eyes with surprising bravery, and murmuring words that pierced through his carefully built armor. "You're the first person who held my hand and didn't let go. Can I call you my hero?" And Daniel, a man who had faced cutthroat negotiations without flinching, felt his throat tighten and his eyes sting, struggling to hold back emotions he thought he had buried forever, so he managed to smile through the ache and answer in a voice that cracked against his will. "No, sweetheart, I'm no hero, but I promise, I'll never let you cry alone again." And for a fleeting second Lily leaned across the table and placed her tiny palm over his much larger one, her warmth soaking through his skin as though she were healing something broken inside him. And Daniel realized that this fragile bond forming between them was not built on blood or obligation, but on something deeper: humanity, trust, and the desperate need of two lonely souls finding each other in a storm. Yet even as the tender moment settled, shadows of Richard's threat loomed large in his mind, reminding him that this fragile peace could be shattered at any second, and that thought made him grip her hand tighter, silently vowing that no amount of money, greed, or manipulation would ever let this child feel abandoned again. The tension in the hospital corridor thickened until it was almost unbearable, Richard's fingers still red from the grip he had left on Lily's fragile arm, Daniel towering before him like a storm waiting to break, his face carved with fury that seemed too controlled, too dangerous, and when Richard sneered, spitting the words, "She's not your problem, Hayes. Walk away." The sound echoed like poison in the sterile hallway, but Daniel's restraint snapped, his voice rising like thunder, roaring with a conviction that silenced even the hum of the fluorescent lights above. "She's a child, not a burden. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." And the declaration wasn't just a threat, it was a promise forged in the fires of his own broken past, a vow that the abandoned boy he once was wouldn't ever let another child suffer the same fate. And Lily, trembling, clung to the edge of his jacket, her wide eyes darting between the two men as if she could sense the invisible war raging between power, greed, and humanity, until the sharp footsteps of hospital security shattered the standoff, two guards rushing down the corridor after hearing the raised voices, their presence forcing Richard to reluctantly release Lily, his lips curling into a twisted smirk as he backed away, his eyes still locked on Daniel's, seething with hatred as he spat his parting words. "You can't buy family, Daniel, you'll never keep her." And with that venomous warning lingering in the air, security escorted him out, his protests fading into the distance. But the damage had already been done. The threat, the malice, the promise of further war clung to the air like smoke after a fire, and Daniel, standing tall but shaken, felt Lily bury her face against his side, her small body trembling as if afraid Richard would reappear at any second. So he bent down, wrapping his arms around her protectively, whispering softly that she was safe, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Yet even as the words left his lips, the chill of Richard's warning gnawed at him, because money had always been his weapon, his shield, his only identity. But now he realized this fight was different. It wasn't about wealth or influence, it was about heart, about choosing to stand for something that couldn't be bought. And when he returned Lily to Grace's room and saw the fragile woman stir, her tired eyes opening just long enough to catch sight of her daughter safe in Daniel's arms, something in his chest cracked wide open, for in her gaze he saw both gratitude and fear, and it mirrored the haunting memories of his own childhood, nights where no one came to protect him, days when he prayed for someone to say the words he had just spoken to Lily. And as he sat in the dim light of the hospital room with the child pressed against him, Daniel found himself staring at his reflection in the window, rain sliding down the glass like tears he refused to shed, and he whispered to himself the truth he could no longer deny, that protecting Lily was not just about saving her, it was about saving himself, about rewriting the story of the abandoned boy he used to be. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Hayes, the man known for ruthless power and icy control, felt the warmth of a purpose greater than wealth, a purpose born of kindness, love, and humanity. And though the road ahead would be filled with battles against Richard's schemes, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not walk away, because walking away now would mean abandoning not just Lily, but the very child he once was, the one who still cried in the rain deep inside him. Daniel sat frozen at Grace's bedside, her frail hand gripping his with surprising strength, as though she knew time was slipping away faster than either of them could hold on to, her voice trembling, but filled with an acceptance that cut him deeper than any wound he had ever endured, whispering about fate and kindness, and how maybe destiny had written their stories to intersect here, so that Lily would not be left alone. And as those words spilled out, Daniel's eyes flooded with tears, because he remembered every scar of his childhood, every night he had begged for someone to stay, every morning he had woken up to emptiness, and it hit him like a tidal wave that Grace, this fragile woman who once shielded him when the world had beaten him down, was now entrusting him with the most precious part of her soul, her daughter. And that trust felt both like an unbearable weight and the purest honor he had ever been given. And as Grace's breathing grew shallower, Daniel's mind spiraled into memories of the time she had pulled him out of a gutter years ago when nobody else cared, how she had believed in him when he was nothing, how she had said, "You still have a future." And now fate seemed to mock him, offering him Lily in exchange for losing Grace, and his heart shattered at the thought, clutching her hand tighter, whispering promises through his sobs that he would never let Lily suffer the way he did, that she would always know safety, warmth, and love, that he would fight tooth and nail against Richard, against the world itself, if that's what it took. But as he poured out those desperate vows, Grace's body suddenly convulsed, her eyes rolling back as machines screamed around them, and the hospital door burst open with doctors and nurses flooding in, pushing Daniel aside though he refused at first to let go of her hand, gripping harder even as they pulled him back, shouting medical terms that blurred into a meaningless storm in his ears, and all he could see was Grace collapsing against the sheets, her chest rising erratically, then faltering, and he wanted to scream, to shake the world and demand why it always stole the people who mattered most. But instead he stood trembling, fists clenched, feeling Lily's tiny fingers slip into his trembling hand from behind, the little girl's tear-streaked face tilted up at him with terror in her eyes, begging silently for him not to leave her like everyone else had. And as Daniel pulled her close, shielding her against his chest while the doctors fought desperately to stabilize Grace, he whispered brokenly that no matter what happened in that room, she would never be alone, never, not as long as he breathed. But inside his heart cracked further with every second the monitors wailed, because this was no longer just a fight for survival, it was the cruel twist of fate forcing him to face the possibility of losing the woman who once saved him, and the test of whether he was strong enough now to save the child she loved most. And as the beeping flatlined and nurses shouted for the crash cart, Daniel's breath hitched, praying with every fiber of his being for one more miracle, one more heartbeat, because if Grace didn't survive, then destiny had left him standing at the sea. Ross, roads of love, loss, and a promise that could never be broken. Grace's body lay motionless on the bed as the doctors rushed in, their voices urgent and sharp, machines beeping frantically, Lily screaming for her mother, her tiny fingers clinging desperately to Daniel's sleeve as though he were her only anchor in the storm, and Daniel, with his heart hammering in his chest, whispered prayers he had never believed in before, pleading silently that fate would not steal this fragile woman who had once saved him when he was a starving boy, begging that Lily would not be orphaned by the cruel hands of destiny. And when minutes stretched like endless hours, the room suddenly hushed as Grace's weak eyelids fluttered open, her breath ragged yet alive, and a nurse whispered softly, "She's stable," sparking a flood of tears that Daniel had buried for years, and Lily launched herself onto the bed, hugging her mother as though she would never let go. And Grace, pale but smiling faintly, reached out her trembling hand toward Daniel, her voice frail but laced with recognition as she said, "So, you were the one who heard her cry?" And in that instant Daniel felt the full weight of his journey, the years of cold boardrooms, empty penthouses, loveless nights, all meaningless compared to this child's touch and this woman's faith. And with tears running down his cheeks he took Lily's hand in his own, pressing it against his heart as he answered, "Yes, and from now on, I'll hear every cry, every laugh, every whisper, because she's not just your daughter anymore, Grace, she's mine too." And the words broke something open inside him, tearing down the walls he had built, the walls that money and power had only made higher, and Lily's wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at him with hope so raw it pierced through his soul as she whispered in disbelief, "Does that mean I finally have a dad?" And Daniel, unable to hold back, pulled her against his chest, his arms trembling as he wrapped them around her tiny frame, whispering into her hair, "Yes, sweetheart, you have a dad now and I'll never let you cry alone again." And Grace, her tears rolling freely, watched them with the softest smile, whispering, "Maybe fate brought you back to me not just for me, but for her." And Daniel knew she was right, knew that life had circled back to rewrite what was once broken, to give him the chance to be the man he had needed as a boy, to give Lily the father she had been praying for. And as the sun began to rise through the hospital window, painting the sterile room with golden light, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, because in that moment, a ruthless millionaire ceased to exist, and in his place stood a father, not by blood or by wealth, but by choice, by love, and by the humanity that had once been buried in him. And as he kissed Lily's forehead, promising silently that no greed, no Richard, no darkness would ever take her away again, Grace closed her eyes, not in weakness but in peace, knowing her daughter was safe at last. And Daniel finally understood the truth he had run from his entire life, that family is not something you are born into, it is something you choose, something you fight for, something you build with love and sacrifice. And with that realization he held Lily tighter, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and warm, and for the first time since he was a boy abandoned and forgotten, Daniel Hayes felt whole, complete and redeemed, not through riches or power, but through the simple, unshakable bond of becoming a father. And as Lily whispered one last time, "I love you, Daddy," the man who once believed himself incapable of love finally knew he had everything he had ever been searching for, not in skyscrapers, not in millions, but in the fragile hands of a child who had chosen him.